Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. This week, Talli Rosenbaum and I were honored to host a live Zoom panel discussion dealing with the Netflix miniseries Unorthodox. Unorthodox tells the story of Esty, a member of the Hasidic community in Williamsburg, who leaves to live a non-religious life. She leaves her husband, and she leaves her community. Her marital life with her husband, Yanky, and in particular, their dysfunctional sexual relationship, is fraught with conflict and unhealthy intervention of other people. Moreover, Esty is seen as having little autonomy over her body or entitlement to withhold sexual consent. And the portrayal of Hasidic life, and specifically intimacy in the Hasidic world there, transcends the series per se and transcends its specific locale and raises issues of importance to everybody in the Jewish community. Talli and I were honored to have Sara Schapiro-Halberstam, Yehudis Fletcher, and Diana Melnick as our panel. I want to welcome everybody, our panel and our viewers, to our very first Intimate Judaism live Zoom panel discussion. My name is Rabbi Scott Kahn. I'm here with Talli Rosenbaum. And today's topic will be unorthodox intimacy and authenticity. How accurate is the Netflix series portrayal of Hasidic intimacy? So Talli, convening this panel was your initiative. I'm really looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to hearing what our panelists have to say today.
Yes, I really am. I think we have a great group together. Scott, can you please go ahead and introduce our panelists?
Absolutely, I will do so. So our panel is made up, first of all, of Sara Schapiro-Halberstam. She's a licensed mental health counselor. She's a certified sex therapist. She has a private practice in New York City where she provides individual general psychotherapy and sex therapy. Relevant to our discussion tonight in particular, she specifically has experience working with Orthodox and Hasidic men and women. Sara, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Yehudis Fletcher. She's an independent sexual violence advisor at Migdal Emunah, a charity providing support services to Jewish people who have been impacted by sexual abuse. She also founded Nachamu, a think tank examining extremism in the Jewish community. And Yehudis is also a student of social policy at Salford University. So Yehudis Fletcher, thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And we finally have Diana Melnick from Toronto, a registered psychotherapist with her own practice, Toronto Intimacy Counseling. She also does a lot of individual therapy for women who suffer from mikvah-related anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder. She's been a Kala teacher for 10 years and currently runs seminars for Kala teachers and Chasam Rabbanim on how to properly teach intimacy and sexuality, which, as a Chatan teacher myself, I know is a sorely needed service. So, Diana, thank you as well for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to be speaking about the Netflix series that was inspired by Deborah Feldman's memoir. It presents a very, frankly, unflattering view of the Satmar Chasidic world in Williamsburg. And we're certainly going to address whether the portrait offered is a fair and accurate portrait, but we also have numerous other issues that we want to talk about that are directly related to the Intimate Judaism podcast. Specifically issues such as intimacy, sexual autonomy, the ways that unorthodox relates to issues that go beyond the Hasidic setting of the show. So we'll get to all that shortly. For 30 seconds before we begin, I want to remind our viewers to please subscribe to the Intimate Judaism podcast on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. You can visit intimatejudaism.com, where you can join our mailing list, as well as gain access to the complete podcast archive and more. And you can write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Let's start off, and before we deal with some of the questions directly related to intimacy, consent, etc., I think we have to start with the question that I've been seeing discussed all over the place repeatedly, and that specifically is, how true to life is the picture of Hasidic life, or specifically Satmar life, that's portrayed in this miniseries, Unorthodox? Diana, can we start with you? What's your opinion about how accurate Unorthodox is in its portrayal of Hasidic life in the Satmar community?
Okay, so first things first, I am not Satmar, and I never was Satmar. So that's first of all. Any information I have is information I've gotten from close friends and clients. So the truth is, unfortunately, some and a lot of what was depicted is unfortunately true and accurate. Does that mean that the way it was depicted happens for every Satmar couple? Absolutely not. But is it triggering to those who have gone through similar experiences? Absolutely. It happens. Yeah.
Sara, what's your opinion about it? How real is this? How real a portrayal is this?
I'll follow Diana with giving a bit of a background of myself. I did not grow up Satmar. I grew up Belz, which is another large Hasidus, and definitely on the spectrum all the way to the right. The information that I have, again, is about the clients that I see. I do see a lot of Satmar clients from both Monroe and Williamsburg, and then friends, and then people who I've crossed paths with. There are aspects of this movie that are true. There are definitely aspects of this movie that is sensationalized. I would say many of my clients have said that they felt validated by seeing this on screen. Many of them have gotten tired trying to explain to people what it's like growing up in that world. And specifically, what I've been hearing from my clients is they've gotten tired of educating their therapists about it. So what I personally very much appreciated, as much as things are sensationalized, and it's not a documentary, it's a movie, is that therapists are getting insight and they're getting some type of picture of what this might have looked like for some of their clients, or still looks like for some of their clients.
I see. Yehudis, how about you? What's your feeling about this?
So I don't know about the other panelists, but I also didn't grow up Satmar, but I grew up a very strict Litvish background, and I married into a Satmar family when I was 18. And I don't usually talk a lot about my personal experience from that perspective, but I can go as far as to say that, yes, it's an accurate depiction of certainly what I went through. And now in my professional work, both through Migdal and through Nachamu, I hear this story again and again and again. And I think it's important to differentiate between, did it happen exactly that way? Was he wearing the tzitzis? Was he not wearing the tzitzis? And, almost trivia like that. And actually what's happening for the girl in that moment. Does she have agency? Does she have autonomy? Who's the perpetrator here? Is there a perpetrator? And if so, is it the husband? Is it somebody who's telling the husband what to do? Does the husband have agency? And to me, those are the more important questions. Is that accurate? And for me, yes, that was an accurate portrayal.
Okay, thank you. Talli, perhaps you have some questions and can take it from here.
Yeah, so first of all, I really want to thank all of our panelists for joining us and for presenting your impressions. I really don't want to spend too much time on whether the depictions of Hasidic life are accurate in the way that they were portrayed in the show. Obviously, this show it aroused many feelings, and if you look at the social media, there are going to be many, many defenders of the faith. And that makes a lot of sense, because if your role identity and your identity formation is wrapped up in being Hasidic, and you are seeing your community and yourself being portrayed in such a negative way, you're going to be defensive about it. It makes a lot of sense. And I think if somebody did a documentary on the modern Orthodox world portraying us in such a way, we would want to defend our world because we're very closely identified with that world. We also have a lot of validation happening because of this show, and many people coming out and saying, that's exactly what it was like for me. And I think Sara and Diana and I, all the three of us, work with couples and women and men. Even just today, I spoke to somebody who said, that's exactly what I went through. And I also think that there's a third response. Unfortunately, I think that there might be a tendency to fetishize Hasidic sexuality. And there's also a lot of myths. Is it through a hole in the sheet? Is it this way? Is it after 12? Do they not have any foreplay? And there are unfortunately a lot of myths. I like to be a very culturally sensitive person and therapist, and I very much humanize people, and I think this has a tendency to dehumanize. But I don't want to talk specifically only about Hasidim in this context. I really want to talk about autonomy, and I want to ask our panelists to speak to the spectrum of the experiences of women, and to some extent men, who are given a specific date in which to experience their sexual debut. And I think that there's something that cuts across all cultures when sex is not necessarily something that you do out of passion, desire, and decision-making that now is the right time for me, but rather that sex is something that you have to do to consummate the marriage, whether you're talking about kind of a faith-based culture, or whether it's because I want to get my virginity over with when I'm 16 or 17 living in a secular culture, or later in life, whether it's an obligation by the calendar because it's mikveh night, or lahavdil, whether you're on a date with a guy and it's the third date. I think we need to be able to talk about the idea of sexual autonomy universally. So that is the first thing I want to talk about, and I'll have more questions as we go along. But I was wondering if perhaps Yehudis can speak to this first.
Thank you, Talli. Hit the nail on the head. And I'm going to just start with you, where you actually introduced us as saying people fetishize the Haredi community and ask an almost unhealthy amount of questions about how a very small amount of people have sex. And really, it's important to step back and say, well, why are those questions important? And kind of broaden it and think about less about the individual people. So if we can try and remove the people, whether they're Hasidic, whether they are evangelical Christians, whether they are so-called secular people, whatever it is, everybody engages with their sexuality in either healthy or unhealthy ways. And everybody should have boundaries that they feel comfortable with themselves and that haven't been put on them by somebody else. So nobody should be engaging in any kind of sexual conduct that they don't consent to. So consent means also that they have capacity to consent. So they're agreeing to have sex, but are they in a position to agree to have that sex? And then you can go one step further back than that, saying, do they have the agency to have that capacity to consent? So they might be able to say the words, yes, I want to, even after maybe they've had lots of alcohol to drink, or when they feel under extreme social pressure from their parents because they've gone home and it's the night of the wedding and somebody's going to be asking the question in the morning. So those are different scenarios in which people might feel socially coerced to consent, but might not have the agency to consent. So I think those are three important points. One is, are they consenting? Two, do they have the capacity to consent? And three, do they have agency in that moment?
I just wanted to chime in here and say that, Yehudis, those are all great points. And to me, this is one of the crucial areas where we have been seeing a shift over the past, I would say 15 years, in terms of Kala teachers and Chassan Rabbanim, right? So whereas 15 years ago, the most education, the majority of Haredi or more, religious folks got from their Chassan and Kala teachers was put a pillow under your bum for the first time, right? And then they didn't teach anything else. They didn't teach about anatomy. They didn't teach about pleasure. They taught nothing. In the past 10, 15 years, there's been a big shift where there's training now for Kala teachers and Chassan Rabbanim. Now they're learning more about pleasure, sexual response, and so on. So I think, again, it's not perfect, but that is a little bit of the shift where now we're trying to empower the Kalas to talk to their Chassan, right? We're trying to empower them to have a little bit more of a voice within the confines of halacha, obviously, and depending on what, the rabbi has determined for them, which sounds a little bit like an oxymoron.
Well, it just sounds like it is an oxymoron, because if the rabbi is determining it for you, or the askan is telling the couple what nights they will do it or must do it, there is a conflict with autonomy. There is an existential conflict with autonomy.
Yeah, and I think as Orthodox Jews, we can use that argument. My whole entire life is a conflict with autonomy because I follow halacha, right? I follow halacha. So right. Literally from the moment I wake up, I am being dictated by my religious beliefs of how to conduct myself.
I think there's a lot to say there, and this really leads me to my next question, and I'll ask you, maybe Sara, to chime in on this one. Look, I've been asked a lot in my life, and I kind of want to talk about trauma. We have a panel, some of us are therapists, and I think that what we could recognize on Esty and what we recognize very often in our patients is the ability to kind of get through something which feels overwhelming to them by disassociating or kind of having this out-of-body experience. But I also think we have to recognize that the people that we see are people who are coming to therapists, and that, there's a part of me that would like to believe that there are couples for whom it actually works okay. There's a part of me that wants to believe that when a person's role identity and when their identity formation is so strong and their belief in their way of life is so strong, that this protects them. Sara, what do you say about that?
I'm happy you're bringing that up because I do think that it's true that it works for many couples, and many couples either fumble their way through and they find a way to make it work. Others, the faith is so strong and this gives them so much meaning and is protective for them, and this works well for them. What we're speaking here today is mostly about the couples who this doesn't work for, or they don't even realize that it's not working for them. And the part that I'm always the most concerned with, and that's what shows up in my therapy room, is yes, that they're getting this education about Judaism is pro-sexuality and it's pro-intimacy and it wants you to have a good sex life and it wants you to, to bond with your husband or wife. But the reality is that their first sexual encounter is very often with someone who would be considered a stranger, specifically for the couples who don't speak or meet during the engagement. So the split happens. Their first sexual encounter creates an immediate split between relational and non-relational sex. When we get into the conversations around consent, I always struggle because I don't want my community where I grew up or the people around me to feel that they're being told, oh, you don't have consent, or this is rape, or this is assault, blah, blah, blah. Because there is consent. Again, like what you brought up, is that this is their religion, this is their belief, this is what protects them. So consent might be different than how we would define consent in the rest of the world. So I'm more concerned about the non-relational aspect that occurs rather than, is this autonomy, is this not autonomy, but is this connecting or disconnecting?
I think that's an interesting point because it speaks also to the male partner and his experience of consent. I think that we can't look at this as there being a perpetrator and a victim, because very often the male partner is himself a victim of the social structure which is impelling him or compelling him to perform this act, which feels very anxiety producing and often doesn't, succeed. And I think that I use this word in air quotes because very, very often the beginning of a sexual life for many, many religious couples, and this is the whole spectrum. This is not just in Hasidic life. This is to the most modern, that, we have to succeed. It has to be able to work. So I'd love for you to talk to the male experience. Scott, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had a quick question I wanted to ask Sara, and I feel very much like a layman in this case. I don't have any expertise, obviously, in counseling. Sara, I wanted to know, based on what you just said, in balancing the benefit that a couple gets from the social structures which don't provide them with agency or consent, is there something which you would recommend? In other words, obviously we all say that consent and agency is crucial. But on the other hand, if that social structure provides meaning in such a way that the couple is willing to forego, without perhaps even realizing it, agency and consent, do you think that it's worth it? In other words, is that something which we can say, yes, obviously in an ideal world, you have it all. But if this is what's necessary for them to gain meaning, is it something which is voidable or something which can be ignored? Or is it the sort of situation where, no, we can never, ever say there's no agency and consent, that trumps all? What's your feeling about that?
So I'm happy you're bringing that up. I think we can remedy the system. I don't think the system needs to be cut out, and I don't think the system should continue to be enforced. And that's why I like using those terms connecting and disconnecting rather than consent, because if we can find a way where the couple gets to a point where they're not having sex with a complete stranger the first time, meaning to say, are they talking throughout the engagement? Are they meeting throughout the engagement? Is there some type of relationship beginning to form that now when they get to the first night or the first week of having sex, it's not with a complete stranger, so now they have both. Yes, it's true. It's not exactly what we fantasize about or what's out there in the secular world or what we see in movies, etc. But we now have both. We have some type of relationship, but we also have the religious values that support us and protect us and kind of bringing these two together. So I would say we need to remedy the system. I wouldn't say either or.
So I think it's like bang on, Sara. Absolutely. It's something that needs to be remedied, and it can be remedied. Our heritage is precious. And the tendency to say either in or out, this kind of binary, it's either the movies and the secular world that's great and wonderful, or it's Hasidus that is great and wonderful. Actually, our heritage is precious and it's been working for millennia, and we can make it carry on working, and we can continue to learn and make it better. And so thank you, Sarah, for saying that. I do want to bring up the age at which many young couples get into their marriage as being a really, really important factor. Some girls are getting engaged. I had a friend who got married when she was 16. And although that's unusual, it's not unheard of by any means. And so these are essentially minors who are getting into a lifelong commitment, particularly the women, because of issues around Gittin. So they are kind of consenting, but are they really consenting? And we've already explored issues around that. And they're getting into a situation that, as you said, Sarah, begins with a kind of disconnecting experience that many, many women later on describe as traumatic. And also men, I've spoken to men who've said they felt both raped and rapists in description of their wedding night. So it does cause trauma for many, many people. And this is happening at a time when people are really, really very young.
To respond to your question, Talli, what you were asking, and Diana, what you mentioned about the men, I do want to speak about the men because the men are struggling just as much as the women. Their experience is, again, very non-relational, very technical, very masculine focused. Can you get it done, Talli? Like what you were saying, can you get it done? And you need to get it done. There's also a lot of pressure around foreplay of, yes, we want you to have foreplay, but also be careful, we don't want you to ejaculate. Yes, chassan teachers and college teachers might be teaching the young men about foreplay, kissing, touch, intimacy, but they're also experiencing an immense amount of pressure of, I need to get this done and I need to make sure I don't ejaculate. So they might be skipping steps and just like quickly moving along because they're so focused on this one thing that they need to be doing. And my male clients, and I have more experience working with men than with women, most of them will 10, 15 years later speak about their first few weeks of marriage and the shame that they experienced looking back to what that looked like, how they've interacted, how they've treated their wives. The damage runs deep, and I very strongly believe it's something that can be remedied and doesn't need to be this way.
And if I can add one thing, I was recently contacted by a big chassan Rabbi posek type individual. He contacted me because he said something very strange is happening. And what he said was that so many of the chassanim these days are suffering from erectile dysfunction on the wedding night and beyond. So I think exactly as you're saying, like there's so much pressure on them to perform and get it done, and it's just backfiring.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to move this discussion along. One of the very interesting topics is the topic of vaginismus that Esty suffers from. Somebody wrote and said, can you please talk about why Esty couldn't have sex with her husband and why she seemed to be able to have sex with that hot guy in Germany that she met? And I did want to just talk for a moment about vaginismus and also in the context of what it is and how your body says no when you don't have a voice to say no. You know, sexuality is partially cognitive, it's partially the emotions, and it's partially the body. And as we talked about, it's also partially sociocultural, the messages that we receive. And when we experience sexuality, we're there with everything, including the body. And I think that with Esty, her story was one not only of sexuality, but in a bigger way, her story was about identity. Who am I? Who am I as a Jewish woman, religious woman, married woman, and who am I with my body? I think she seemed to be very disconnected. There was a scene where she's talking to the college teacher and she's explaining about the 2 holes, 3 holes, and she says, oh, well, I don't have that. And I saw people writing on Facebook that that's ridiculous and that's impossible. But as Diana knows and Sarah knows, it's absolutely not impossible for women to not be aware of their bodies in that way. So I think this too brings us back to the idea of treatment. And I have seen this. Again, Yes, I've seen this in Hasidic cultures, but I've seen this throughout cultures. First of all, when a couple has a problem, it's a couple's issue. But very often it's turned into, you have an issue, your body doesn't for some reason accept sex. And then the standard treatment really has a lot to do with kind of creating a container for the male organ. And many therapists or counselors or physical therapists or sexologists will collude into this message of, even though your body's saying no, you know, you have this adaptive survival mechanism of a contracted response so that you're not allowing this in, you know, we're going to give you dilators so that your body will allow it anyway, without necessarily doing the kind of developmental self-work that needs to get done, or even talking about pleasure, talking about enjoyment or exploration. And so if you want to maybe comment on that vis-a-vis the why not with Yanky and why with Hot Guy in Germany?
I'll speak to that. So first, I do want to say that there's an aspect of the TV show that does this really quick switch, you know, the sudden, she just leaves and she suddenly has this whole group of friends. And I think that's inaccurate. The experiences that my clients and colleagues and friends have had have been many, many years of transitioning out. It doesn't happen that way. You know, who knows if she actually would have had such a great sexual experience the first time in real life. But putting that aside, there is a difference between understanding sex as a language and a form of communication, where that sometimes gets lost with Hasidic couples because, again, there's this deadline and this is when it happens, and you're not allowing yourself to connect to your body and get in touch with your body and to understand what, first of all, just arousal feels like, but also using sex and intimacy and touch as a form of communicating, as a form of talking to your partner. And I think the switch that we see between her not being able to have sex with her husband, you know, if it was vaginismus or not, the fact that she was having pain during sex and she was anxious and she was tense, and to her, sex was a job, it wasn't a form of communication, versus now when she's with this hot guy in Germany, what I imagine, what I fantasize happened in that scene is that she was starting to connect to her body and recognize that sex can be something used as a way to express ourselves or as a way to connect, and it's not just a mission.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, which is something, again, like I agree with that part, to me was a little bit unrealistic, because so many of my clients who are not even Jewish, non-religious at all, and they talk about this struggle with the pelvic pain and how it's been years, and they can orgasm, some of them, and they can feel pleasure, but they still are unable to have penetration, right? So I don't know that it would have happened so easily in that, like the way that they showed it, but definitely the struggle is real. And Talli, just speaking to what you mentioned earlier, the way that we go about treating women's pelvic pain, it's not just in the Orthodox world, right? Like this is the pelvic pain, the gynecological world at large. How many of my female clients have come to me saying, well, I've been to an OBGYN and I've been to this and I've been to that, and everybody told me I was fine. Women's sexual health is so under-researched and underfunded and understudied across the board. We're just trying to, you know, catch up to it, right? So all the new research, right, Talli, you're actually one of the main researchers that, you know, people in the field such as myself, we look to your research and we build on it. So for example, in my clinic, it's very important for me to have the pelvic floor physical therapy, in addition to myself who's working with the couple, in addition to sometimes bringing in an individual therapist who's going to do some trauma work, right? So we try to really treat it holistically and not just focus just on becoming a vessel for penetration, right? Like that isn't going to work in the long run.
Thank you. It's actually not sustainable. And one of the reasons why I moved over into psychotherapy from the field of pelvic floor work as a physical therapist was that really patients would come in and they would say, do whatever you have to do so that it doesn't hurt me. I don't have to like it. I just have to be able to do it. And that really would break my heart. That's really setting the bar so low for your own expectations. And, a part of me really wanted to say, what is that about? But I didn't have the tools. And so I still really respect and honor the work that pelvic floor physical therapists do. It's great work, but without the component of the couple's dynamic and what's going on, what are the social messages, and what's going on individually, and the trauma. And I think it's also important, a lot of people think that if there's vaginismus or there's pain with intercourse, there must have been previous trauma or child sexual abuse or something that happened. But what we don't consider enough is the fact that for many, many women, the first few months of marriage, trying all the time, and women and men, they talk about their first few weeks of trying and not succeeding, and trying this position and that position, and turning it into such a thing that has to get done, that in itself becomes the trauma. And I'm going to move to Yehudis now, because one of the frequent dynamics in that is that, unfortunately, and I have heard this, and I've heard this more than once, women have been told that if your husband wants to have sex, you really can't say no. You have to keep trying and you have to do it. You don't really have the right to say no, because otherwise he will ejaculate, and that will be a sin, and that sin will be your fault. And, this is something that Scott and I have dealt with in the podcast frequently. But I also want to say that even when you're not talking about the shfichat zera, I don't know how to say that, the ejaculation, the idea of I need to be able to have intercourse because I can't say no to my partner, my husband, my boyfriend, because otherwise he will leave me or something else will happen, is a kind of cultural message that cuts across cultures. We even talk about mate guarding, and there are even several studies that have come out in the literature around women's sexual pain and their experiences, where women don't tell their partners that it even hurts them, or they report that they have sex with pain for the purpose of what's known as mate guarding. So again, I'm questioning you, Yehudis, if you find this to be a universal issue, or we really need to look specifically in our communities.
So it's an issue that spans communities, absolutely, particularly if we're looking at not just our religious community, but other religious communities. And I think it's really helpful to look at how other religious communities have addressed these issues, oftentimes successfully, so that we can learn. Because the solution is not break apart the frum community. The solution is not, let's just label everybody as bad and everybody has to leave. On the contrary, everybody should hopefully stay if that's what they feel they can do, and let's make this community safer and better. Because otherwise you're providing people with impossible choices, saying either you can have autonomy and healthy sexuality, or you can have your family and friends and security. And that's not a fair choice to ask people to make. Oftentimes people say, well, this community is very hard to access, so we have to offer people difficult choices. And I just think that's such an easy way out. We're just people. Like you said earlier on, sometimes people fetishize this community as somehow marvelously different to every other community, and we are not so different. We're not so special. We've got ordinary human problems, because we are in fact ordinary humans who've got certain issues that are absolutely universal. And I wanted, if it's okay, to speak about one of those universal issues, and that is attraction. A lot of what we've spoken about is how to heal a healthy marriage when it started off traumatically. And we haven't addressed the issue of what happens when it's not actually a happy marriage. So either it could be abusive, which happens in some cases, but also, a lot of the coupling that goes on is completely random. And some people in the wider world, people get together for all kinds of reasons. Women feel pressured to settle down in their 30s. They think their body clock is ticking, or in many, many communities, not just ours, forced marriages occur. And also in our community, we have really, I think some people struggle with the term forced marriage, but there is a lot of coercion when it comes to why two people are set up together. And it's not necessarily because we think those two people will be able to connect very well together and they're absolutely suited to each other. Sometimes there are other considerations around finances, around which sect people belong to, around what kind of education people have had. And then you say, these two people are together. The first night that they got together was inherently traumatic, and now we're going to try and fix that. But we're not asking the question, are these two people really suited to each other? Are they attracted to each other? There's a whole percentage who are LGBT plus who just are never going to get along and be able to meet each other's needs. And some people just won't be attracted to their spouse.
Is there a particular issue, though, that we can point to, which is obviously not maybe the key, but the most common problem? Let me give you an example of what I mean. Is it the fact that in cases like this, as you said, Yehudis, cross-culturally, the idea we must start a family? Or is it, for example, at least I know very much in the Hasidic world and in the Orthodox world in general, the assumed prohibition against outer course or anything other than vaginal intercourse? Is any one of these prohibitions or values, or call them what you will, one of the strongest markers that can lead to people having problems such as those depicted in Unorthodox?
I want to add to your list, which is the stigma against childless and single people. There's a huge stigma against single people. You know, you can have a 20-year-old with a diamond and a sheitel who is taken very seriously when you have an accomplished 35-year-old single lady and her word is nothing. So just to add.
I hear that. And the reason I mention it in particular is Talli and I have spoken about this several times on our podcast. The assumed prohibition of outer course is something which is widespread, I'm sure, cross-culturally, and certainly in the Jewish community, and especially, I believe, in the Hasidic community, because, as we've mentioned, it's largely based on mystical sources more than halachic sources per se, or if I were to reframe that, on halachic sources that are using mystical sources as their inspiration and as their source. We've mentioned openly that this is something which I don't believe is actually a true prohibition in many situations. And the question is something like that, along with the other things you mentioned, Diana, are these things which, if they were removed, would it remove the problem, or would they simply be filled with other problems? This is a fundamental human issue. Yehudis, you wanted to answer to that?
So if we're talking about our own community, I think the first thing that I would remove and that I've advocated for removing is the expectation to consummate the marriage on the wedding night. I think it's something that causes trauma to so many people, both men and women. And I don't understand. I've looked at the sources. I don't understand where it's based in halacha. And wherever anybody actually has any kind of halachic reasoning behind it, surely the damage that it causes should mitigate against that. And it does cause damage. And I think the key is to communicating the amount of damage that it causes.
I really also want to add to that. I don't even think it's helpful to say you don't have to do it on the first night. It just keeps pushing it off to the next night or the night after. I really think that the whole kind of intervention into when a couple is going to do it, ever, it's really nobody's business. And I think that whole siach, that whole dialogue about did you do it, when did you do it, and here's some lubricant so you can do it, that's what needs to change in a big way. And we need to be able to just let couples figure it out for themselves and communicate to each other, get to know their own bodies, get to know each other's bodies, and, not look at whether or not they're touching on their wedding night.
I'm happy that you're bringing this up about it's not just about the day, that you don't need to have sex on the day of the wedding, because I have heard chassan teachers and college teachers telling young men and women, you don't have to do it on the day, but it always comes with all these clauses of, but you need to get it done before Sheva Brachos is over, or you better get it done before she gets her period, because then we don't know if you're going to be married. And they're putting all of these additional stressors that the couple still has a time clock. And I think one of the ways to remedy this, and I agree with you, Talli, that it's no one's business and couples need to figure this out and find a time that works for them, would start even earlier with fixing the dating system and fixing the time span that the couples are engaged. I mean, there are couples who are engaged for a full year, and the last time they spoke was a year ago. And this is not foreign. This is pretty common, especially with girls who are younger when they get engaged, like 17, 18. So I think it's not just about that day that's traumatic, but it's also, we have to start this process of couples communicating and getting to know each other way, way earlier.
I wanted to ask Diana what your feeling is in terms of teaching Chatan teachers and Kalat teachers, which is something that you do. are these values that you think they should be taught, or do you have a different approach than that which has been mentioned until now?
So again, I think that in general, there has been a big shift, as I keep saying, definitely at the micro level, if not at the macro level, right? So in my network of Kala teachers from all over the world, they fall on the spectrum of Judaism and Yiddishkeit. Our push now is to communicate with the Chassan Rebbe, because typically the Chassan and the Kala will not talk about this between themselves, right? They're not going to talk about sex. They're not going to talk about intimacy. Sarah, as much as I admire that approach and I agree with you, there should be something that changes. Realistically speaking, a Hasidic couple is not going to talk about it before the wedding. So what we try to do is we have the Kala teacher communicate directly with the Chassan Rebbe and advocate for our Kalas. And that's the shift. We're trying to get the Kala teachers to be an advocate for their Kala. And more than that, what we try to do is get the Kala teacher to read between the lines of what the Kala is saying. Because the Kala could be sitting there saying, yeah, no, I'll be fine with it. But she's shaking and trembling, and you know that she has anxiety, and that's not okay. So even if the Kala is telling you she's cool with it, you read between the lines and you intuit what she needs, which she might need an advocate. Now, going back to also the timelines, this comes back to our earlier oxymoron. As a frum Jew, I have no autonomy for certain things, right? So for example, if the halacha says there has to be neshika before the woman becomes a nida, right? So there has to be genital contact before the woman becomes nida, otherwise they can't be in yichud. That's my box. And as a frum Jew, I'm going to have to stay in that box. I can try to make it as pleasant as possible. I could try to make it as empowering and lovely as possible. But at the end of the day, as a frum Jew, I'm going to want to stay in that box. So this is where it gets really messy and tricky.
I think that accepting the status quo and saying we need to deal with reality as it is denies agency to the humans. We are just people, right? And there are so many of us, and we have this enormously high birth rate, which means there are even more of us than you could ever imagine. And in 20 years' time, there's been studies done in the UK that show we will be the majority of the Jewish community because of our birth rate very soon. So to say that, we want our Kala teachers to be advocates for our Kalas really doesn't sit well with me. On the contrary, we need to be empowering our young people to be able to have that conversation with our chassan, to stop agreeing because they don't really agree to begin with. Nobody's ever asked them, are they saying yes to an engagement? They're just saying yes because they've never really entertained what it might be like to say no. And that doesn't just mean what they're like in terms of their sexual agency. These are, have they ever entertained what kind of clothes they'd really like to wear and how they'd really like to wear their hair and what they'd really like to do in terms of higher education. I know we need to wrap this up, but I would really ask you, anybody listening or participating in this, really bring it back to the individual here and think about their individual worship and their individual experience of Judaism. It has to be bound in free choice. Otherwise, we don't have a real concept of Adam Haba.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to just relate to a couple questions coming in. This one's for Sarah. It's from Andrew Nachum Klefter. Would it be fair to say that autonomy and consent are for many young adults getting married in the Hasidic world not really the way they look at their life choices? In fact, do they believe they even had a choice in who they married? I think you did kind of talk about this a little bit. How would you respond to that?
So it depends. Yes, I do have clients who say that they did not choose who they married, and when they imagined who they would marry, this didn't fit the profile. But when my clients come into my room at the point that they're showing up, very often what they're saying to me is, I've learned to like this guy or girl for whatever he does bring to me, but I want to figure out to make this work. I want to make this better. Now, my job is to really help my clients assess is the reason and the motivation for making this work just because of community stigma? Is it just because you have a family and you're afraid to leave them, or you're afraid that who knows what else is out there? Or is this truly, are you truly at a point where you're able to make a decision to say, I want to make this work? And Dr. Klofter has taught me, and I've started using that with my clients to say I'm responding back to using what you taught me. To be able to say yes, you need to be able to fantasize about divorce and know what divorce would look like for you. And I spend a lot of times with my clients really assessing all the options so that by the time they make a choice, it is a choice that they made. Yes, they didn't make that choice when they married the person, but now they're in the marriage, and I want to find a way that they can make this a true choice this time.
Thank you. Aviva, say who you are and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Aviva. I'm a couples therapist, and I've worked a lot with Haredi couples as well as with Hasidic couples. And one of the things that I have encountered is that the whole concept of pleasure sometimes isn't even within their jargon. And all of a sudden, I've had to really take a couple steps back and examine all of my assumptions about what I consider important in a sexual relationship. And all of a sudden, saying, okay, they're living in a completely different culture than what I live in. And really having to question a lot of my basic assumptions about what their goals might be versus what my goals might be as a therapist. So I just wanted to know if anybody else, who works as a therapist has also had that experience, and how do you deal with that tension? And I am a very culturally sensitive therapist, but there are times where I sit there and I kind of go, I'm not really sure what my role is here, because I don't want to take apart their culture and their values. On the other hand, they're really struggling with a sexual relationship that's not working.
Right. I always try to go with my client at where they're at, right? So if I don't know so much about Indian culture or African culture, I might ask them to educate me on their cultural norms. And I ask them to guide me and say, I can give you my advice or my perspective as a sex therapist, but I need to hear if it conflicts with your ideals or your values. And then I go into what I was trained to do as a sex therapist. And of course, I'm always trying to tune into where it doesn't sit well with them, where they would like a little bit more guidance, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I do often is I try to get involved in asking them to check with their rabbi, or trying to check with their person who's guiding them, right? So sometimes I'll recommend something and they'll say, no, we were taught that you can absolutely never do that. And I'll say, that's interesting. Why don't you call up your rabbi and say, I'm in therapy and my therapist has suggested this. And I always offer to speak to their rabbi personally, because I found that way when they're hearing it straight from the medical or the mental health professional, it does definitely hold a bit of weight in terms of the way the halacha is paskin for them.
Sara, do you have a similar approach, or is your approach different?
I would say I have a similar approach. I try very much to leave it up to my clients to talk to their rabbis. If they don't have somebody, I usually have somebody that I can recommend, because that's where I want this to be the couple's experience. I don't want it to be a rabbi or a college teacher or a chassan teacher talking to each other. I want the couple to figure out what works for them, what's their normal. Again, everyone's normal is different, and what's theirs.
I'm Fraught. I'm a psychotherapist and work from London. I'd just like to ask, I also want to hear about their culture, and I'd also like to meet them, what they're at, where they're at. And in fact, I often, I'll use their language. So if they call sex thingy or whatever, or fun or whatever, or intimacy, I'll use their language. I'm just thinking of a couple I had where both he and she were using the language of, she needs to make herself available. And she was talking about, I need to be available. And I just couldn't use their language. And I said to them, I said, I'm really sorry. I'd really like to call sex whatever you're going to call it. But this just goes against the grain, because it's not about being available. It's like, can I borrow your lawnmower? I don't know what it sounded like. What you do when you want to meet the couple where they're at, and what they're describing is positively abusive, whether objectively you think this is just not okay. And that's what they're describing as their norm or their culture. You can't meet them where they're at. So what do you do then?
So I know you're not a therapist, but your hand is up. So I would like you to comment.
So I'm not a therapist. I'm an ISVA, which is an independent sexual violence advisor, which means I meet clients who are in a state of crisis. They've experienced sexual trauma. They've acknowledged that. They're not coming to me for treatment. They're coming to find out what support is available, and if they make a decision as to whether or not they want to go through the criminal justice system. And I absolutely, Shifra, bang on. there are universal human rights, and some of those rights address sexuality, and it is abusive to, I remember one woman who said that her husband said that she was his parking space, and he was entitled to be able to park in his parking space. So that was the level of availability that was expected of her. And that's an abusive attitude, and it needs to be called out. So it doesn't matter if that's somebody's normal, and it doesn't matter if that messaging is coming from a cultural or religious space. The therapist has, frameworks that maybe I'm not part of, but as an ISFA, where I'm working sort of in a slightly separate space, it is my role to make somebody aware of their rights and make somebody aware of what might be being perpetrated against them in right now, irrespective of whether or not they've come about something in their past or something that's current right now.
Okay, I just want to say one thing in addition. Obviously, I'm not a therapist either, and that's exactly my point. I believe that rabbis or halachic authorities or spiritual advisors very often need to know when this is not an area which they are versed in. They don't know enough to give advice here. We are trained in certain areas of halakha, certain areas of spirituality, and yes, certain areas of psychology and therapy and the like.
Jewish law, for those who might not be familiar.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. Yes, Jewish law, etc. However, we have to know as well when a couple comes to us for counseling, marital counseling, if that's not something which we have been taught how to do, it doesn't mean we can't give advice as, so to speak, a layman in that area because they just want to hear what we have to say. But we have to also know that we're not equipped necessarily with the tools to give proper advice, and that has to be made clear to the couple. And I would not be at all surprised if people who say, oh, that's my parking space, as you said, Yehudis, or it's my parking space and I have the right to park my car there, they probably got that from an unqualified rabbi. I think just rabbis have to understand themselves when this is not in our wheelhouse and someone needs to be referred to someone whose wheelhouse it is in.
I want to say that I am never averse. I always start with, this is the medical, this is the psychological, here are the facts, here's how it works. And now if you feel like it's a halachic complex, you can go speak to your rabbi. If your rabbi has an issue, I will always make myself available. At the get-go, I always give the psychoeducation so my clients know what's healthy, what's appropriate, and then we take it from there. Just because it's halakha does not mean it's safe and healthy.
Yeah, and also like in my first session, you're doing your, confidentiality piece and your consent piece. So you're always saying that if there's abuse, we have to talk about that. And so I don't think that in any situation, it would be improper for the professional to say, to me, this sounds abusive, right? In your own language and working with the couple the way that would best suit them.
Thank you. We have time for one more. I said Devorah, so go ahead.
Thank you, Talli. First of all, phenomenal discussion. I had two questions. One, or kind of points with questions. So the first one being the original comment from Yehudis, the idea of kind of bringing up autonomy as a feature of the therapeutic relationship, also a therapist, and kind of the piece that's kind of snagging on me a little or nagging me a little bit is that idea of cultural competency, that idea of kind of stepping into the space where the client is, meeting the client within their cultural norms to some degree in order to create an alliance and ultimately meet the client where they are. And that kind of worries me when I'm hearing things like, kind of introducing them to the concept of higher education, or how do they want to wear their hair, or what kind of clothing do they really want to wear? And kind of I question that as a culturally responsible culture with cultural humility, can I really approach my client that way? Even though I personally feel very strongly about that, am I really going to create an alliance with my client that can actually be effective? And that I kind of as a question mark, I don't really have time to address that. The second thing that I wanted to bring up, when Shifra brings up that question of availability, of when I need to be available, that is a trend that I'm actually hearing quite a bit within the Hasidic women that I'm working with in many of the cultural communities, and I'd love Sara to respond to that. This concept of if I say no, then he's going to go elsewhere. And it's an internalized message that they're actually getting from their teachers. This is being taught to them. This is not an assumption. And when I even brought up the idea of expressing, because I work within the perinatal loss community. So when they say, they're coming home mikvah post-loss, and they're like, I can't even imagine being intimate. Their response, when I say, well, then can we communicate about that? And they're like, no, but I can't say no because I must be available, instead of understanding the concept of communication with the partner. My question on that is, how do we address that so again, cultural norm versus the perception from the community of, I can't say no because then they will go elsewhere. So I don't even know if there's a full question in there, but I'd love you to address that concept. This is not an assumption. This is absolutely something I am hearing from the women, that we cannot say no, cannot say no.
Yes, absolutely. I've been hearing that. I hear that from my clients. The men will tell me this is what the women got from their college teachers. This is a message that's being passed on. I have to be available. The interesting part that I started to notice is that when a man is not as sexually active as the college teacher claimed he was going to be, my female clients start to worry, and they start to think, is there something wrong with me? Is he not attracted to me? Is he going elsewhere? So the problem that's happening is that the men are being painted as sexually ravenous and just, all over the place. And if we don't have these boundaries, he's going to pounce on you. Instead of it being that this is a communication and a language between the two of you, that you find a way, you find that dance together. So it's not just about the girls being worried that if I'm not available, he's going to find it elsewhere. There's also the flip of it, is that, oh, he's not jumping and pouncing all over me. There must be something wrong with me, because the only thing that they've learned is the way that a guy will express his interest is through sex, and not through other means of communication and intimacy and touch.
Thanks.
So yes, Shifra, I agree.
I want to thank our panelists. I think what you just said is really important, and it really points to how societal messages shape and develop the sense of a sexual self, such as many of our young men are brought up really believing those messages, that they don't have self-control and that they do need to be tamed, and that they'll come to marriage and that will be their wife's role, is to kind of help regulate them sexually. And then there's, the cultural messages to women that your role until marriage is to not arouse men, and then when you get married, to arouse your husband. And I think that they very much shape your sexual identity. I want to thank everybody.
I definitely want to thank all of our panelists, Diana, Yehudis, Sara. This was great. And we've been doing this for about 20 months, I think, Talli. And this is the first time we had a panel discussion like this, and it's certainly not the last, because you really all added so much to the conversation. So thank you for joining us today. Stay healthy, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Intimate Judaism. Next week, Talli and I will be presenting a follow-up episode where we offer some of our own opinions about the miniseries Unorthodox, as well as the issues that it raises. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.